In 1985, two climbers made history by scaling a dangerous route in the Peruvian Andes. But on the descent, triumph turned to nightmare. One climber fell, breaking his leg, and was left dangling over an ice cliff. The other, struggling to keep him suspended, faced a brutal choice: cut the rope to save himself, or risk both their lives. But no one could have predicted what happened next. Joe Simpson and Simon Yates were two ambitious British climbers attempting a Siula Grande, a 6,344-meter peak in the Peruvian Andes. Though relatively unknown in the mountaineering world, they were respected for their bold, minimalist approach, carrying minimal gear to move fast, a strategy that left no margin for error. Their goal was to conquer the mountain's infamous west face, a sheer glacial wall that had defeated all previous attempts. The two were accompanied at base camp by a third companion, a climber named Richard Hawking, who helped with logistics and equipment, but would stay behind while they tackled the climb, awaiting their return. Due to Siula Grande's extremely remote location, Richard was the only support they'd have if anything went wrong. And so, with supplies packed and spirits high, Joe and Simon began their ascent up the untamed west face, unaware this climb would change their lives forever. From the start, the mountain was relentless. The brittle high-altitude ice shattered under their axes. Vertical blue ice walls and loose rock forced them into constant split-second decisions. One mistake meant death. Nights were spent perched on tiny ice ledges, huddled against brutal winds, sleeping in short bursts as avalanches thundered down nearby slopes. But after 3 grueling days, they stood on the summit, greeted by breathtaking views of jagged peaks and endless snowfields. But from the top, they saw dark storm clouds closing in, and they knew the descent would be even more treacherous. As they began to descend, the mountain turned even more hostile than on the climb up, with snow whipping through the air and icy wind biting at their faces. The storm was closing in fast, and the once clear route was disappearing beneath a swirling blur of white. Each step became more dangerous as even the rocky sections turned slick and unforgiving. Midway through their descent, they reached one of the toughest sections, the West Face's ice cliff, a nearly vertical wall of brittle, unstable ice. Navigating it required precise climbing technique and ice-cold nerves. Every move a calculated risk against the precarious shifting surface. About a third of the way down, Joe was watching Simon work his way down the wall. Don't fall here, he thought. Simon was above him, and the slack in the rope between them meant that there was no safety net for this brief section. To secure his position, Joe swung his right ice axe into a frozen wall, but as his pick dug in, the ice gave way. Joe plunged and hit the base of the cliff feet first. His right leg bent unnaturally backward, the metal crampons on his boots driving the impact directly through his knee. The damage was catastrophic. His tibia punched into his femur, smashing through his knee joint, tearing ligaments, shredding cartilage, and fracturing his heel and ankle. Pain exploded through him so intensely, he nearly blacked out. At first, Joe was in shock and denial of what had happened. He tried to stand, but the attempt only unleashed an agonizing crunch of broken bones grinding against each other. He collapsed, gasping for air through the pain. When Simon appeared moments later, Joe's face said it all. "Are you all right?" Simon asked. "I've broken my leg," Joe responded. Dread filled Simon's face. Moments ago, they had been equal partners, relying on each other's abilities. Now, Joe was completely incapacitated, and they still had 3,000 feet of descent ahead of them. But they refused to give up. Simon rigged a rope system, painstakingly lowering Joe down the mountain in 300-foot sections. It was slow, agonizing work, but it was working. Then, disaster struck. With poor visibility, Simon accidentally lowered Joe over a hidden cliff. Joe was left dangling in midair, unable to climb back up, and Simon, unable to see or hear him, had no idea what had gone wrong. For over an hour, Joe hung there helpless while Simon struggled to hold on to the rope, which was slowly pulling him closer to the edge. The snow beneath Simon's position began to shift and collapse, threatening to give away entirely. Meanwhile, the storm was growing fiercer, whipping icy winds and snow around them and making every second on the mountain more dangerous. The urgency was clear. If Simon didn't act fast, both of them would be pulled to their deaths. Simon was faced with one of the most agonizing choices imaginable: hold on and risk dying alongside Joe, or cut the rope to save himself. Simon held the knife in his trembling hand, staring at the rope that connected him to Joe. He didn't want to do it. Cutting the rope felt unthinkable. It meant giving up on Joe, leaving his close friend to die. But he couldn't hold on any longer, and if he didn't act, they could both fall to their deaths. With no other options left, Simon made the most difficult decision of his life. Taking a deep breath, he sliced through the rope. For a moment, there was silence, and then Simon heard the faint sound of Joe falling into the void below. The rope went slack. Simon was now safe, but the overwhelming guilt hit him like a wave. Convinced that Joe couldn't have survived, Simon climbed down the mountain alone, feeling as though he had just lost his friend forever. What he didn't know was that Joe was still alive, and that his fight for survival was just beginning. Joe crashed through an icy bridge and into a deep crevasse. When he came to, he was disoriented, in agony, and surrounded by towering walls of ice. He pulled on the rope, only to feel it go slack. It had been cut. Instead of anger, he felt relief. Simon must have survived. For hours, he screamed his name into the darkness. No response. By morning, Joe accepted the truth. Simon wasn't coming back. Trapped in a glacier with a shattered leg miles from camp, Joe knew staying put meant death. Looking up, the steep ice walls were unclimbable. His only option was to go deeper. He tied himself to his remaining rope and began lowering into the unknown. If he ended up hanging in empty space, he left the rope untied. Better to fall than wait to die. To his relief, he landed on a sloping pile of avalanche debris. From there, he spotted a narrow passage leading upward. He had a way out. Crawling was his only option. Using his arms and one good leg, he dragged himself up the snowy slope, each movement sending waves of pain through his shattered body. It felt endless. But finally, he emerged into the blinding sunlight. For a brief moment, he felt triumph. He had escaped the crevasse, but his ordeal was far from over. Joe still had to cross 1.5 miles of glacier, then another 6.5 miles of jagged, rocky terrain. Even uninjured, the journey was brutal. In his condition, it was unimaginable. But he had no choice, and so, channeling every ounce of strength he had left, he began to crawl, carrying himself forward on his stomach, using his elbows and good leg to inch along. Using his watch, Joe broke his journey into small, manageable goals to create a sense of structure and discipline. He would set targets, like reaching a crevasse or a red rock, in under 20 minutes. Achieving these goals gave him small victories to celebrate, while falling short left him frustrated. But the system worked. It kept his mind focused on the immediate next step, rather than the overwhelming reality of his dire situation. After 3 agonizing days of crawling, Joe was within a 10-minute walk of camp, but his body had reached its limit. Starved and suffering from ketoacidosis, his muscles failed him, and he drifted into vivid hallucinations. Even the small act of checking his watch, his one tether to reality, slipped away. What should have been minutes turned into a grueling 9-hour crawl. At camp, Simon and Richard were preparing to leave, mourning the friend they believed had died 4 days earlier. When a faint noise reached their ears, they dismissed them as the wind, until something about them made Simon grab his headlamp. Scanning the darkness, he froze. Against all odds, Joe, broken, barely recognizable, was crawling toward him. Stunned, Simon and Richard rushed to him, their grief turning to disbelief and relief. But their ordeal wasn't over. With no stretchers, they placed Joe on a mule for a brutal 2-day trek to the nearest road, followed by a 23-hour pickup truck ride to the hospital. No one knew if he would survive. 11 days after his fall, Joe made it to medical care alive. His near-impossible survival became legend, chronicled in his memoir Touching the Void, later adapted into a renowned documentary. Incredibly, he returned to climbing 2 years later. Though some criticized Simon for cutting the rope, Joe never blamed him, knowing the decision had been necessary. Today, he shares his story as a public speaker, a testament to human resilience. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe for more amazing survival stories. Hope to see you in the next one.